All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'd like to say how honored I am to receive this invitation to speak at your university, University of Ibo Akademi. In Finland here is highly regarded. I'd like to congratulate faculty, administration, students, and the broader community as well. To Chancellor Carl Gramberg of the university, the faculty, the students, staff, to everyone, I thank you so much for this great invitation. Also applaud you for the exceptional work going on there at the university. We know that these are very hard times with regards to the global pandemic. So we thank you for your efforts in advancing education, also in helping to support future generations of learners. Also like to say a special thank you to Heidi Katz, who has been intricately involved in the process. We were supposed to have this summit, if you will, last year, and due to the pandemic, we were unable to, so we were forced to move this to a virtual environment. And I want to thank Heidi for her exceptional work. Also, Mattis Vingram, who's been doing a lot of the IT work and making sure the technology is working well. I'd like to thank Mattis for his outstanding work as well. And Emmanuel Atta, who is not here with us, I'd like to thank him as well. He originally reached out to me with regards to giving this talk, and I was so delighted to see some of his work and to have an exchange with him over email. Also, Mats Wickstrom, thank you for your gracious introduction here. I'm indeed honored to be here with you at the university. Also, I'd like to acknowledge two of my doctoral students from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Annette Tisdale, who's a candidate for the PhD in curriculum and instruction, urban education. Also, Erin Lewis, who is with us as well, who is a candidate also for the PhD in curriculum and instruction, urban education. Thank you so much. So today, my talk is entitled Nurturing Minority Student Success, Disrupting Curricular and Pedagogical Violence while Promoting High Achievement. I have been at my current university for approximately 15 years, and I think I've been in education now for a little over 20 years. And through my journey as a foreign-born person and attending universities in the United States, also living in 4 or 5 countries and visiting a number of countries, I became very much interested in this topic and issue of minority education, both from a historical and contemporary context. I'd like to begin by pausing and having a moment of silence, really, for those who are not here with us by way of perhaps many years of colonialism, the indigenous people whose lands we often reside on and have universities on, and who are often not allowed or in very small numbers in these institutions, and are often the subjects of many studies. I'd like to have a moment of silence to sort of acknowledge indigenous people and Native people and African ancestors as well. If you will, we'll take a brief moment of silence, and then we'll proceed with the talk. All right, thank you so much. All right, so for today, we'll be focusing on this whole notion of disrupting curricular and pedagogical violence. And we'll be looking at quite a bit of data in international data as well, comparative data looking at student achievement and outcomes across countries. We'll also focus a bit on school processes that promote high achievement in minority students, culturally responsive teaching, instruction, curriculum design, school leadership, policy as well, and look at that in the context of effective strategies that help to increase student achievement, also provide resources for you as well, okay? And so in the context of our talk today, we should be thinking about this notion of curricular violence, and it is more or less a deliberate attempt at academic programming, which manipulates the intellectual and psychological well-being of learners. Curriculum violence is a framework that I published in the book here to the left. And when minority groups are omitted from the curriculum development process, it usually results in a curriculum that focuses on the interests of a dominant group at the expense of minority groups. I want us to think about world history as well. Think about who has power. Think about how people use power in the context of education. We should also think about the curriculum as a contested site. In the United States, there have been a number of litigations surrounding what can be included in the curriculum, especially in regards to issues surrounding indigenous and native groups, African and African American populations, and the very notion of including information about these groups is contested to the extent that it has resulted in a number of litigations and legal challenges. And so we should think about the curriculum designing as telling us who is important, who is worth knowing about, and who is not. I'd like us to listen to a short excerpt here from Angela Davis and Jane Elliott, and I think it speaks a lot to our talk for today. Allow me to indulge in about 2 minutes here. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this nice and clear. Thank you.
The first victims of racism were indigenous people in this country. And so that means we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Okay. Jane, you want to comment?
You want me to comment?
Yes, ma'am. Sure do.
You don't really want me to comment because I'm really angry. I want you folks to do something. I want every white person, every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the white race to stand right now. Right now. Every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the white race. Now, remain standing. Now, remain standing. Now, will every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the black race please stand? Up, 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 up. And remain standing. Now, the brown race. Anybody who considers himself or herself a member of the brown race. Now, the yellow race. Now, the red race. Now, will look around you, people. Practically everybody's standing. Now, will every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the human race please sit down? Now, people, You are all members of the same race, the human race, which started with black women between 300,000. Don't interrupt me. I don't have much time. Now, white folks, you don't like it, but all you are is faded blacks. That's the way it is. Every one of you, if you trace your DNA back far enough, you're going to find that some of your DNA came from Africa, because we all have the same ancestor back there, every single one of us. And those of you who think you don't have are obviously from outer space.
Yes, thank you so much. So that was a conversation on race and privilege with the renowned scholar and activist Angela Davis, and also the illustrious Jane Elliott. I want us to think about the notion that all human beings share 99.9% of the same DNA. However, this idea of the social construction of race, one of the most powerful human creations. There's a book entitled Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luckman. And it talks about how people or humans construct social meanings. Scientifically, there is no basis scientifically for the concept of race, in as much as all human beings belong to the human race. Social construct that we are accustomed to, we can say started as early as about 332 BCE. Now we're thinking about curriculum design in terms of who has power, who is represented, who is omitted, thinking through to about culturally responsive teaching, pedagogy, the art of teaching that seeks to affirm and validate students' home culture as pedagogical tool when teaching. It also seeks to embrace this notion of cultural competence. By cultural competence, the context of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings and Geneva Gay, they argue that teachers should at least learn to become bicultural at least. That is, to have some command of course, your own culture, but at least another culture. And to be able to use that as pedagogical tools now in the context of the curriculum, thinking about the social construction of race. In a powerful documentary that came out a few years ago in the US, it was released on PBS, the public broadcast station, entitled Race, the Power of an Illusion. In this piece, I like to use it in my courses at times, going around the world and in different communities, we see the power of a construct that was set in motion and became more or less a part of a global parlance. We said as early as 332 BCE, Greeks invading most of North Africa under Alexander. Some people call him Alexander the Great. However, we don't wish to enthrone people who colonize and enslave others. But anyway, we have set in motion now the massive and powerful Greek Empire, followed by the Romans. And then later on in the 1400s, precisely at 1441, if you read a book called The African Diaspora by Thompson, he explains that at 1441, the Europeans would enter into North Africa, seeking perhaps honorable trade, but then seeing the amount of gold that was there, particularly at a place called the Gold Coast. Gold Coast today is Ghana. 1441 becomes very important in history in terms of curriculum design. History also helps us to understand what we have in school processes today. Helps us to understand lesson planning. Helps us to deconstruct power. Now, and hopefully to become multicultural, become inclusive, and to engage in equitable practices in the classroom. Here is a graph that shows visualization here of issues of racial discrimination in the UK. And just like the United States, I think these data are suggesting that the minority population here around the UK and in Finland, that these are indeed important issues. And so people's experiences with racism, institutional forms and structural forms of racism, sexism, sometimes xenophobia. In the UK, there are a lot of immigrants from many different countries, including other Europeans. But there are also people who are discernibly, phenotypically, can be identified quickly as outsiders. African immigrants, Asian immigrants, immigrants from Central and South America, the Caribbeans, refugees. How are they treated in schools? How are they treated in the broader society? And what does this say about who has power and who has privilege? Privilege. Privilege to be included, privilege to be a gatekeeper, privilege to design lesson plan, curricula, privilege to design lesson plan, curricula, privilege to determine who is accepted into what programs, who is excluded. All right. Now, given the context of curriculum violence and the deliberate, manipulation of information in the context of education, in the United States, it is still a common practice in many schools that the curriculum reifies Christopher Columbus, 1492, as a quote-unquote discoverer. I'd like us to think about these discovery narratives. When we claim that someone discovers a place where people have lived there for sometimes centuries or even millennia, and then to enthrall that the place was quote-unquote discovered, socialization and ideological practice. Now, think about what this means for students to be learning that a European explorer discovered a place in the 1400s on commission by Ferdinand and Isabella, and also by the Pope to do expeditions. What about the people who were there before? Are they important? What does it mean when they're not even mentioned? In the case of the Americas, as early as approximately 800 BCE, before the Common Era, a group of people called the Olmecs are generally regarded as the pioneers or the earliest to enter the Americas, often omitted from the curricula. And coming all the way up into the 1400s, all of the native and indigenous groups who were in the Americas are considered null and void. Now, in the book entitled Unshackled Education for Freedom, Student Achievement, and Personal Emancipation, I think that work gets at some of these issues and how to disrupt curriculum violence, how to become multicultural in teaching, multicultural in lesson planning, multicultural perhaps even as an administrator who may make decisions about teachers, about students, in the context of a university, even about faculty, who is hired, who is terminated, how to become multicultural and to become a better advocate regarding issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. On the book on the right, Education for the New Frontier, in the context of the world now, 1865 in the US is the end of the Civil War. We should preface that the history of the Civil War too needs to be recasted as Abraham Lincoln and the Union Army opted to release slaves only in the South if they were willing to fight on the side of the North against the Southern Confederates, and perhaps as a military move. Now, we look here now at some international data. These data are from the Trends in International Mathematics Science Study, often called TIMSS. And these data here are showing us student performance at 4th grade level in 2019. And it shows us a baseline here of about 525 perhaps as an acceptable score. And we look at the countries by rank in terms of scores on TIMSS. And we can talk about issues of reliability, validity, are these data reliable, valid, etc. But this is a highly respected data set. And there's some common characteristics here of high-performing countries, also of effective teachers of minority or even low-income students. And we'll talk more about that, right? Now, looking at some data here with regards to 8th grade students in TIMSS in the subject area of mathematics. And here again, we see the distribution of countries. And looking at the graph here, we see some of the higher performing countries like Singapore, in some cases, China, Korea, Hong Kong, etc. And we should be thinking about what does it mean to have a high quality educational system where people have equal access to quality instruction from a content master, which is also culturally responsive in teaching. When students have multicultural curriculum, when there's equity in funding, also a great deal of anti-racism work. Now we look at some data here from the National Center for Education Statistics in the United States. The Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, often called PEARLS. It shows the average 4th grade reading scores and across countries. And the darkest blue shows students, the average number of students who scored lower than 400. And to the very right are the ones that are above average. And I think it's safe to say even in Finland, there's also room for growth, as there are still a good number of students who struggle. Similarly, in the United States, and we'll talk through what are some of the best practices in the classroom, also in relation to school policy as well. Next set of data we're looking at here are average scores in 4th grade students in TIMSS. This one is for science. And there we see the average. Also, we look at the distribution of scores that are above, let's say, 540 on this graph. And actually, Finland in this data set scores very highly or very well. However, we know that there are inequities in schools, even in Finland, especially by social class, by gender and race, and even immigrant status. And so how do people who are considered to be outsiders, people with minoritized identities, how do they fare off in schools that were not made for them? In classrooms where they may hardly ever see a teacher who looks like them. In a curriculum or in books and content in the classroom where they never see themselves represented. Imagine going through school most of your life and you never saw someone who looked like you teaching or in any of the books or the course materials. You rarely ever saw anyone who looked like you or any contribution from anyone who is not a member of so-called the dominant group. Think about the psychological effects, even in regards to maybe gender. If young girls never see a person who is a scientist ever and never had a female science teacher or STEM teacher, think about the implications of that. Think about policies and practices that are presumed. Most of these tests are normed for a dominant group. That means norming the tests, it presumes that the knowledge base that we expect students to have command over, and that knowledge base comes principally from the cultural ethos of one group. What we're really testing here, are we really testing knowledge or competence or exposure to the expectations of one group? Antonio Gramsci, an Italian intellectual critical theorist, he refers to this as hegemony. It is the universalization of the interests of one group over all others. Cultural hegemony is when the cultural interests and leadership of one group is exacted over all other groups. And so the curriculum becomes hegemonic as a form of domination. School policies that privilege a reference group over all others. Here we see TIMSS now at 8th grade level. And these are the most recent data. And in this data set, it shows 4th grade students in science. Science and STEM, science and the STEM fields, science, technology, mathematics, engineering, those fields are certainly in high demand. And at 8th grade level, we see students' performance here. And in some cases, there are underrepresentation of minority groups in STEM. Next data set now, we look at PISA, or the Program for International Student Assessment data. And it shows by level, level 1 being the lowest, 2, 3, 4, etc. And I know it's a little bit hard to see, To the very right here is the United States, the United Kingdom. And the data set here is showing us that those students who are performing at level 1, level 2, even in Finland, which is represented here, there are some concerns with underperformance, even on the program for international student assessment. So we're going through different data sets that are considered to be sort of go-to data sets, highly used, highly respected by researchers in the field. However, there are concerns about sometimes sampling reliability issues, but all the data sets, I think when you look at them together, collectively, they give us some suggestion with regards to where we have gaps in access to quality education and where we need to improve student achievement, also improve teacher preparation to teach minority students, low-income students, etc. Now, go to PISA again now by subject area now is mathematics. These are average scores for 15-year-old students. And PISA, here again, we see the distribution of the scores by level. So below level 1 would be considered very concerning. That's the darkest blue, or this shade here. And then level 1, then we have level 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5 being high and ideal. And so below level 1 and at level 1 and level 2, even in the case of Finland here, we could see there are some concerns. In the case of the United States, we could see there are also some concerns with similar patterns of below level 1, at level 1, and level 2 of low performance. And that suggests some concerns for 15-year-old students. And this is mathematics scores, according to PISA. All right, we continue now in PISA again, proficiency levels here in science. And again, below level 1, and then level 2. And here we see the United States here, and Finland here in the middle. It's a little hard to see. Apologize for that. But we see concerns too with there's some high performing areas, and then we see underperformance. And this is consistent to, this is Canada here. And we see some similar trends with the same issues. So what are the benefits of high quality education? What are the benefits of high quality education nationally? And how can we help to nurture an educational system where a person is not disadvantaged by race as a social construction? In fact, there's racial prejudice of some sort in all countries. All human beings perhaps have some level of bias, which we can become aware of, and we can work to mitigate in terms of making sure that the best we can, that we don't exact bias in how we interact with others. Also, in regards to how we make decisions, racial bias, gender bias, maybe bias surrounding issues of sexuality, ageism, etc. Have some data here from the Ministry of Education in Finland, and this is, I think, the most recent data as of 2019, and it shows uh, gender, age, and level of education. On the left, we have men. On the right side here, it shows women. If we look at basic education, there are some similar patterns. And then when we look at upper secondary and tertiary education, I think we could say that there is some parity, but there's also much to be desired with also increasing gender equity as well. Yeah. And in this data set, similar to the United States, school funding tells us who is important. How do we fund public education? And this table here from the ministry shows the expenditure by type of educational system and at various levels as well. And so comprehensive gets approximately 40.7%. And there you see upper secondary and university education, research university shows about 19%, vocational education about 15%. And so we see the distribution here of the funds in regards to various levels of education. Now, school funding, what about minority people? And what about programs that help perhaps students who speak other languages and are immigrants to the country? Bilingual education. Linda Darlin Hammond, who's a highly respected professor, I think emeritus, Stanford University in California. She explains that bureaucratic solutions to problems of practice will always fail because effective teaching is not routine. Students are not passive and questions of practice are not simple, predictable, or standardized. Consequently, instructional decisions cannot be formulated on high, then packaged and handed down to teachers. So what are the characteristics then of high performing countries? And then we'll talk more about, and within high performing countries, what about high performing schools with minority and low income and immigrant students? What are the characteristics of high achieving minority schools? Okay, let's hear Darlin Hammond as she talks a bit about high achieving schools and high achieving countries. 1 minute here. Thank you.
So what you see in high achieving countries is typically a very lean set of standards. In Finland or Japan, for example, all of the math standards can fit in about 10 pages from K-12. They are very clear about what needs to be taught and when and how it builds over time, but they're not overly prescriptive. By comparison, in the United States, many states have created good standards. In some states, the standards are sort of a mile wide and an inch deep. There are 300 things to cover in each grade level, not a small number of things to do well and deeply. And the content coverage of large numbers of objectives superficially means that we end up reteaching the same thing over and over again year after year because we didn't stop and do it well and deeply at a moment in time. So our kids study fractions in 3rd grade and then again in 4th grade and 5th grade. Many of them don't get it. They're back at it in 6th and 7th, and there are high school students who still haven't mastered fractions. Whereas if we spent, as many countries do, a quarter of a year on a single topic, working on it deeply, you could then understand it deeply enough to move forward. And I think this accounts for the low achievement that we see in part in this country relative to other countries. Take a country like Finland, which ranks first among all the OECD or European nations in reading, math, and science on the PISA assessments. What goes on there? One thing they do is they train their teachers extraordinarily well. So they are getting 3 years of graduate level teacher education before they even get in the classroom, and they know how to teach all kids well, and they focus on assessments and the teaching of deep.
All right, thank you. And the piece that Darlene Hammond was referring to here is not the most recent one that I showed. This video is probably about 7 or 8 years old, so it would have been the piece of before. The one I just showed is the most recent, and perhaps we could talk a little bit more about some of the sort of slips in terms of going down a little bit on some of the rankings in terms of Finland. All right, now, lesser known knowledge here is that in the Western Hemisphere, this is a study by Yale University, Martin Carnoy and company et al. The small island of Cuba is among the highest performing country in terms of literacy in the OECD countries in the Americas. A little small island has a lot of issues, and of course it's communist past, etc. But it has one of the highest per capita expenditure at the national level on public education. That means that any child from any region can have access to high quality schools, and it doesn't matter with regards to the background. And so what happens when any child can have access to high quality instruction? And so we see literacy scores that are higher. This little country has a 98% literacy rate. There's also a Harvard University study on this as well, and it looks at literacy of students in Cuba. And most countries would be ideal in terms of having 98 or 99% of the population literate, complete a high school diploma, and have free education all the way through MD or even to the PhD level as a part of national policy. And so here we see literacy rates for 15-year-olds. And so the characteristics here of high achieving school system, they must have adequate school funding. That school funding must not be based on a student's socioeconomic status. In other words, such a system would penalize poor and often minority and immigrant students if your parents' income has to determine the quality of public education you receive. And that is often the case in the United States. School funding in the US is principally driven by local property taxes. And so the tax base of the parents' income becomes crucial because it determines what neighborhood the family lives in, which determines how much funding the schools in the district receive, and that sets up a huge problem with inequalities. There's state and federal funding as well, but the local property tax is a significant portion of the funding that goes into school. In contrast, here we have a system with a national sort of school finance and access to a curriculum where anyone can learn the same content no matter what background or what neighborhood the child is from. Now, all right, so Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings is a very famous, well-renowned and highly revered professor of education in the United States and perhaps internationally as well. In the book, The Dream Keeper, she studies the successful practices of minority teachers. And she says students show up with incredible strength and assets. Kids are capable of much more than we think. And she chronicles the practices of teachers who are culturally responsive. In The Dream Keeper, she introduced framework of culturally relevant teaching. Pushing that framework even further, Lisa Delpit, Book on the Left is a classic. Perhaps every teacher should have read The Dream Keepers and Other People's Children. And this is a book here that talks about how to be culturally relevant in teaching and teaching minority students. And Other People's Children, Delpit talks about cultural conflicts in the classroom. What happens when there are cultural conflicts in the classroom where teachers may unconsciously exact bias in how they assess students? What students are referred to for advanced placement or gifted? What students are considered troublemakers? What students are expelled, suspended regularly for the same behaviors as the other children and are exacted with a punishment higher and more detrimental to the child's future? On the Right, the newest book by Lisa Delpit, an edited work, Teaching When the World is on Fire. Very profound as it speaks to the intersections of culturally responsive teaching, diversity, and social unrest. Here we have Joyce King and Ellen Schwartz. Joyce King is former president of the American Educational Research Association, perhaps the most powerful educational organization in the United States. In this powerful book on the left here, Afrocentric Praxis of Teaching for Freedom, she talks about how to teach for freedom by using what she terms Afrocentric or African-centered praxis to teach for freedom against miseducation is a word that Dr. Carter G. Woodson uses in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro. A praxis against falsifications in the curriculum, against hegemonic domination in curriculum, in teaching practices in schools, and also in the broader society. Racism in the broader society in Finland perhaps will impact the same way in the classroom, in schools. Segregation in schools, segregation in neighborhoods, segregation in civic organizations, even religious organizations, all impacting schools and society. On the right, King talks about heritage knowledge. A classic book here, I think, is a good resource that shows the potential of being inclusive in education. The book on the left, edited by Joyce King, Black Education, Transformative Research and Action Agenda, sponsored kind of work through the American Educational Research Association. Really powerful as it unpacks curriculum and lesson planning that are inclusive. All right, on the right, remembering history in student and teacher learning. What about the history of the indigenous people? What about the history of the Africans and African Americans or Black or Afro-Europeans? What about the treatment of Black men and women in Finland? Those who phenotypically cannot assimilate into the dominant group. In other words, no matter how long they have been in the country, as soon as people look at them, you could tell they are not a part of the reference group. Other immigrants can assimilate by losing their accents, perhaps even changing their names to quote unquote acquiesce privilege. How about groups who are unable to change or transform themselves phenotypically and are always visibly outliers? What about the Asian populations in Europe and in Finland? In the context of the US now, 21st century education, and we'll move into our discussion, we'd like to have time for that. In the context of COVID-19 as well, inequities in remote learning, access to technology, also parents who some are better able to help children who are being homeschooled, teachers who are, some are more equipped, others are not. In teacher preparation programs, teachers who are being prepared not to teach any children or even minority and low income children. Most teachers have very little exposure to culturally responsive and multicultural practices, and even placement in urban and diverse school settings as part of their clinicals. Disproportionalities with regards to referrals for behaviors, suspension, expulsion. In the US, we have a huge teacher shortage. And also in the United States, 80% of the teachers are white, the majority are female, but approximately 53% of the entire US student population is non-white. And in many urban school districts, the majority of the students are minorities. There are also opportunity gaps with regards to access to quality teachers, resources, to multicultural content, multicultural and culturally responsive school leaders. Some school leaders may indict teachers regularly for teaching practices they don't understand that are aimed at inclusion. Underrepresentation of minorities in STEM participation. Here's a table now showing the distribution of teachers in US classrooms by race and ethnicity. And you could see 80% white. And then when you look to the right, in science classrooms, it's even more white, 82.5 or approximately 83% white. And so there are very few non-white teachers, especially in the STEM fields. Look at Native Americans, Asians, and Latinx or Latino, Latina. Here we see the distribution of students enrolled in kindergarten through 12th grade. And you can see the distribution is very diverse and non-white. In other words, the white student population is decreasing rapidly. And projected for 2025, the majority of the US student population will probably be in the neighborhood of close to 59 to 60%. And so the minorities are pacing the majority group. What does that mean for teacher preparation, for clinical placements, to become multicultural as a teacher? And then immigrants in the context of the 21st century with wars in places all around the world. We find refugees in our classrooms. We also find immigrants who discernibly are outsiders, people who don't have command of the language spoken in the native, in the host country, rather, and need some support in terms of bilingual education. What funding is there? And how are teachers being prepared to teach language minority students in the classroom, which is becoming more common? In the book, Dreaming of a Place Called Home, this work here shows or speaks to international and local perspectives in teacher education. On the right, the book Education in a Strange Land. This was a very important contribution as it speaks to the number of immigrant students in host countries' classroom and the implications of that. I'd like to briefly show some statistics here on the projected supply and demand of teachers. This is for the United States. Perhaps Finland does not have as big as a teacher shortage issue. But in the US, the teacher shortage has been a very significant challenge. In some states, that shortage continues to grow. And you could see the estimated supply here of teachers. This was before the COVID pandemic, and then the demand for teachers in Black on top. In a recent article in a journal entitled The Urban Review, I published a study looking at the teacher shortage and the cognitive sociology of labor. And what the data shows, at least for the US, is that in times of economic hardship, the teaching profession sees an increase in people wanting to go into teaching. But as soon as the economy rebounds and strengthens, there's an exodus of teachers. And it's very hard to have a high quality education system when you don't have enough people wanting to go into the profession. What are the implications of that for minority students and students who usually have less access to quality instruction and certified teachers in the content area? Here we see STEM or science, technology, and engineering sort of high school majors here by race and ethnicity. And we could see there are some concerns with minority participation in some of the STEM fields. And one of my newest books on the left, since STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so important to us, we have underrepresentation of minorities in STEM, and most teachers don't understand how to teach diversity in the STEM fields. The book on the left is brand new from Routledge, teaching teachers to teach diversity in STEM. On the right, there's a book here, McInnes, shows Edward Boucher. And this person is the first African-American or Black person in the US to have received a PhD. And he did so from Yale University in the 1800s, approximately 1876. And his degree was in physics. And so minorities were not only being denied access to public schools, but there are certain disciplines it was even harder to teach in or get degrees in. The irony here is that this person here, you see his name was Imhotep. The man you see sitting in the chair on the right is regarded as the father of modern medicine. Approximately 1600 BCE, before the Common Era. This man was a multi-genius in North Africa, very Black, highly melanated person. Remember Jane Elliott's comments and our talk about how race is a social construction and the stigma associated with being Black and brown as social constructs and even ideological domination. A Black person or a person of African descent is regarded as the first to have written a papyrus, medical papyrus. That papyrus was later renamed Edwin Smith Papyrus as it was purchased in the 1860s. When we rename things for people who are conquerors, think about the implications. How many teachers would know this and know how to teach this? And what would this mean for a young student in a classroom who may be minority background and not even knowing? And even if they're not minority background, but all students should know this, regardless of race. Here in the US, we have high school completion rate as we come close to the end now and go to our discussion. We see high school completion rate by race and also by level of training. And we see there are some disparities, as you might imagine, in high school completion, also in college and university completion. Now, one of the longest studies ever in the history of the US, the benefits here of high quality education as early as preschool. The study is called the Perry High Scopes Preschool Study. It's the longest longitudinal educational study that is ongoing. A group of researchers in this study, they followed 123 minority students from low-income neighborhoods who were involved in high-quality early education programs and studied their impact and benefits for 3 decades. And the study shows that high-quality education mitigates low socioeconomic status. It also shows that parental SES can totally be mitigated when there is high quality education. In other words, low-income students, we have studies on low-income and minority students who are high performing and perform higher than the entire state. Look at some of my research on high achieving minority schools. It shows the benefit of equitable funding, culture responsive teaching, multicultural curriculum, school enrichment. And so these are benefits, I think, that can work across various demographic groups. All right. On the left is one of my newest book, Healing Power of Education by Teacher College Press of Columbia University. And it speaks to these pedagogical tools of liberation and restoration among low-income and even the broader student population. On the right, the book Power, Privilege, and Education provides a number of studies looking at culture responsive curriculum and pedagogical design and their positive impact on minority students' outcome. So as we wind down here and go into the discussion, really, students cannot control their parents' socioeconomic status. And we should stop using that as an excuse to not teach at a high level and to have low expectations. And we should stop using students' socioeconomic status as a pass on very poor teacher preparation. For many times our teachers are not exposed in terms of clinicals in diverse settings with minority students and students from different cultural backgrounds. They are taught as if they're going to be teaching only students from the reference group, and that is a huge problem. So in spite of being poor and high quality instructional environments free of racism, minoritized students have high achievement levels. Administrative commitments are important, school climate, teacher expectations, community involvement, of course, mentor and programs and other factors are really important. I'd like to point us to some work on high performing, low income and high minority level schools that have 90% or more student pass rates. Look for a book by Chenoweth entitled It Is Being Done, and also a follow-up book entitled How It's Being Done. These are studies on high-performing, low-income schools with a lot of minority students, and they have exceedingly high pass rates. Also, what are the implications for academia? Universities that historically were created to educate mainly one particular population. In the context of 21st century now, the parlance of globalization, diversity, increased migration, with sometimes lack of diversity in faculty, in students and staff, sometimes discriminatory and structural biases and policies that affect some groups differently than others. A new work of mine, Sister Outsider in the Akademi, two of my former doctoral students look at the experiences of Afro-Caribbean women in majority white institutions. And so in conclusion here, curricular and pedagogical violence occurs when academic programs and pedagogical processes are manipulated in ways that compromise the intellectual, psychological well-being of learners. In this sense, curricular omissions and falsifications must be disrupted with inclusive, multicultural, and social justice practices. As such, while there has been a great deal of attention on minority underachievement, less is known about high-performing urban schools and processes that promote minority student success. There's an African proverb, which is really precise. It says, it takes an entire village to raise a child. However, the village must become whole, inclusive, committed, and culturally responsive to promote student growth and development. And to do this work, we must be deliberate in doing anti-racism work in schools, in universities, and even in our homes. I thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. My contact information is here, and I have some helpful resources to share. And if anyone would like additional resources, please use the scan here on the screen, and you can access those resources. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation.